Hello and welcome. If you're tackling constitutional law, especially for exams, you know there are some concepts that are just massive. And federalism, it's one of the big ones. It's basically the architectural blueprint for how power is shared in so many nations around the globe. So today we're going to break it all down piece by piece and give you a super clear guide to this essential topic. So let's start with a question that might seem obvious but really isn't. Think about your day-to-day life. You have to follow local ordinances, you've got state traffic laws, and of course you're subject to national laws on big things like defense. Ever stop and wonder why? Why is it so layered? Well, this isn't just some bureaucratic mess, it's the very heart of living in a federal system. It means you have political loyalties and obligations to more than one government at the same time. That's federalism in action, and we're about to unpack exactly how that whole thing works. All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to nail down a solid definition of federalism. Then, we'll look at the different ways it can be structured. After that, we'll dive into the classic arguments for why it's a good idea. And finally, we'll tackle the really tricky challenges it faces today. This structure is designed to be super clear, especially if you're gearing up for exams. Let's get into it. Okay, Section 1, defining federalism. Look, before we can get into any of the cool debates or the complex stuff, we have to be absolutely rock solid on what we're talking about. So let's build that foundation right now. So what is federalism really? At its core, it's all about dividing power. It's not a system where all the power flows from the top down. Instead, federalism creates at least two levels of government, think national and state, and each one has its own turf where it's in charge. Now, here's the crucial part. This division of power is locked into the Constitution. The central government can't just decide one morning to get rid of the states because the state's power doesn't come from the central government. It comes from the Constitution itself. This big idea is called non-centralized sovereignty, and it is the single most important thing that separates a true federation from other systems. Now, this table here, this is gold for any exam. It lays out the differences so clearly. Let's walk through it. In a unitary state like the UK, all power is ultimately centralized. Parliament is supreme. Simple. In a federation, like the US or Germany, that power is divided by the Constitution. See how both the central and the state governments can make laws that you, the citizen, have to follow? Now look over at Confederation. This one's different. The real power is held by the member states. They just delegate a few tasks to a weak central body. And critically, those central decisions only apply to the states, not to you directly. And check out that last row, the right to exit. In a confederation, the members can legally just pack up and leave. That's a huge fundamental difference. Okay, so we've got the definition down, but federalism isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. It's a common mistake to think there's just one model. In reality, federal systems can look wildly different depending on how they were born and how they spread the power around. So federations tend to be born in one of two ways. First, you've got coming together federations. Just picture the original 13 American states. They were separate, independent places that all decided, hey, let's pool some of our power for the common good, for things like a stronger defense or a single market. Then you have the opposite, holding together federations. These start out as one single unitary state that decides to push power down to different regions. Why? Often it's to manage deep ethnic or linguistic divides and, well, hold the country together, preventing it from breaking apart. You see this story in places like Belgium and Spain. So once a federation is up and running, are all the member states treated the same? Well, not always. In what we call a symmetric federation, the answer is yes. The whole idea is uniformity. Every state or province has the exact same powers and responsibilities. But in an asymmetric federation, things get more interesting. Some member units might get special powers that others don't. This is usually a really practical tool to handle diversity. A perfect example is Quebec in Canada, which has unique powers over its language and culture. It's a way to recognize and protect the unique identity of a specific region. Okay, last piece of the puzzle for this section, how do these different levels of government actually work together? In a system of separate or split federalism, the national government and the states kind of operate in their own lanes. This is a classic US model, often called layer cake federalism, though in reality it's often more of a marble cake where the responsibilities get all mixed up. Then you have the other model, interlocking or cooperative federalism. Here, the states are directly involved in making decisions at the national level. The best example is Germany's upper house, the Bundesrat, where state governments themselves are represented. It creates this constant dialogue and negotiation between the different levels. So we've covered the what and the how. Now let's get to the why. Why bother with this complicated setup? Why choose federalism? This section is all about the powerful arguments, both philosophical and practical, that have been made for it over the centuries. This whole debate is nothing new. It's a conversation that's been going on for hundreds of years. You could say it starts way back in the 1600s with a guy named Althusius, who argued for the rights of different social groups. Then, a century later, Montesquieu comes along and dreams up a Confederate Republic as the perfect way to get the freedom of a small state with the security of a big one. And then, of course, you get the absolute titans, Madison and Hamilton, writing the Federalist Papers. The conversation just keeps evolving, with thinkers like John Stuart Mill trying to figure out what makes a federation actually work in the long run. Let's just pause on this quote from James Madison, because it gets right to the heart of the American argument for federalism. What he's really saying here is that a big, diverse country acts like a firewall. A crazy idea or a passionate mob, what he famously called a faction, might be able to completely take over a single state. But he argued it would be much, much harder for that rage to spread across the entire nation. By splitting up the power, you insulate the whole country from these little political fires. It's a foundational argument for how federalism is supposed to protect liberty. Okay, so the case for federalism is really a two-part argument. First, you have to convince people why a federation is better than a bunch of small, separate countries. Why should independent states even bother to unite? Well, the reasons are pretty compelling. It helps keep the peace between them and makes them stronger against outside threats. It boosts the economy by creating one big marketplace. A central government can step in to protect human rights if a state government goes off the rails. And of course, it lets smaller states band together to have a much bigger voice in the world. So that's the argument for uniting. But then comes the second part of the sales pitch. Why not just go all the way and create one big, all-powerful unitary state? And the answer here is all about checking power and embracing diversity. Federalism is seen as a shield against a tyrannical central government. It allows minority groups to have self-government to protect their culture. It creates way more opportunities for regular citizens to get involved in politics at different levels. And one of my favorite arguments, states can act as laboratories of democracy, trying out new creative policies on a small scale before they're ever considered for the whole country. All right, let's shift gears into our final section. And this is where we get into some of the toughest, most interesting questions out there. These are the deep, nagging challenges that are baked into the federal model. Honestly, understanding these tensions is what separates a good exam answer from a truly great one. And here we are at the central philosophical puzzle of federalism. Just think about it for a second. The classic idea of sovereignty is that there's one final authority. The buck stops somewhere. But in a federal system, who has the final say? Is it the national government or is it the state? The real answer in federalism is it depends on what we're talking about. And that just completely messes with the traditional definition of sovereignty. This philosophical problem creates some very real, very tricky design issues. I mean, how do you even draw the borders for the member states? How do you decide exactly which powers go where? And who gets to be the umpire when the two levels of government disagree? Usually, it's a Supreme Court. But, and this is a critical point for any law student, over time, courts have historically tended to favor the central government, which leads to this slow creep of power toward the center. And maybe the biggest question of all, who has the right to change the rules of the game? Who gets to amend the Constitution? And this brings us to what you could call the core instability of the whole federal model. These systems are always in this delicate balancing act, like walking a tightrope. There's this constant gravitational pull towards the center, which can lead to a system that's federal in name only. And at the same time, there's a pull from the edges, which can lead to states wanting to break away. For a federation to actually survive, it needs more than just a good constitution. It needs what scholars call a federal spirit from its people, a shared belief in the value of this two-level system. Now, let's tie this back to how federations are formed. Remember those coming-together federations like the USA? They were often designed specifically to limit the power of the central government, which can sometimes lead to weaker social safety nets and greater inequality between the states. But then you have the holding-together federations, which are trying to keep the country from falling apart. They often use economic redistribution as a kind of glue to maintain that unity. Just look at Germany's constitution. It actually requires the equalization of living conditions among its states. Two very different approaches. So when people are arguing about which level of government should be doing what, you'll often hear this fancy word pop up, subsidiarity. It's basically a guiding principle that says decisions should be handled at the most local level that makes sense. Power should only be kicked up to a higher level of government if the job just can't get done effectively at the lower level. It's a formal way of saying keep it local unless you have a really, really good reason not to. This idea is a huge deal in debates about government power, especially within the European Union. And so we'll end with this question. to leave you with something to think about. The basic design of federalism is centuries old, but the problems we face today, pandemics that don't care about borders, economies that live on the internet, and a global climate that's changing everywhere, are massive in scale. Do these modern challenges demand more centralized power so we can act decisively, or does the flexibility and local control of federalism make it more important than ever? There are no easy answers here, but how we answer that question will shape the future of governance for all of us.